Former President Donald Trump was in a federal courtroom in Washington today as his lawyer argued before an appeals court why he should be immune from prosecution for his efforts to remain in power. Laura Jarrett has more.
Tonight, a ruling expected any time from the federal appeals court, which appeared deeply skeptical today of Donald Trump's efforts to derail the case about his attempts to overturn the 2020 election.
I did nothing wrong, absolutely nothing wrong. I feel that as a president, you have to have immunity.
The Republican frontrunner watching on in court as his lawyer, John Sauer, urged the three-judge panel to break new legal ground and find the former president immune from prosecution, emphasizing everything he's been charged for took place when he was still in the White House.
We have the prosecution of the chief political opponent who's winning in every poll and is being prosecuted by the administration that he's seeking to replace.
While the Justice Department argues nothing in the Constitution supports shielding Mr. Trump from prosecution now.
Never before has there been allegations that a sitting president has, with private individuals and using the levers of power, sought to fundamentally subvert the democratic republic and the electoral system. It would be awfully scary if there weren't some sort of mechanism by which to reach that criminally.
Judge Florence Pan, a Biden appointee, posing stark hypotheticals on what a future president could do if Mr. Trump's view prevailed.
Could a president order SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival?
The answer, in Sauer's view, yes, so long as the president was impeached and convicted first, pinning much of his argument on the Senate acquitting Mr. Trump at his 2021 impeachment trial, a position DOJ cast as frightening.
What kind of world are we living in? The president has a unique constitutional role, but he is not above the law.
And Laura, what can we expect going forward in this case?
This appeals court is likely to rule very fast, Lester, potentially even this week or next. Now, if Mr. Trump were to lose in front of this appeals court, he could appeal even further, potentially up to the Supreme Court. All the while, though, the March trial date is ticking, and his lawyers have not been shy about the fact that their goal is to delay, Lester.
All right, Laura, thank you. Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.